2024 has entertained us with one of the strongest Formula 2 grids in history, but 2025 might look quite different. A record amount of graduates to F1, F1 adjacent roles and Formula E means the better half of last year's grid are mostly out of the picture, leaving teams scrambling to sign appropriate drivers for the upcoming campaign, leaving us with a surprisingly difficult season to predict. Hello and welcome fellow motorsports fans. As the title suggests, it is time for my yearly F2 preview and predictions video where I'll run you through all the teams, have a look at the individual inter-team duels and of course let you know all of my thoughts about the actual title fight along the way. I've ordered teams based on the strength of their driver lineups, trying to ignore the expected car performance. And as is tradition, we begin with the worst one. Let's go. Our first tier is dubbed Obvious Problems, and you'll see why in just a second. I've given the lowest spot on the list to Van Amersfoort Racing as they are the only team with no obvious upside while still fielding a proven backmarker in Rafael Villagomez. John Bennett making the jump straight from his admittedly rather impressive GB3 campaign is a curious choice and reinforces the idea that the driver pool was simply getting a bit slim this year. I think he'll do alright and he should have a pretty easy time against Villagomez specifically, but this is probably the extent of his success. AIX finds themselves in a not too dissimilar position, although with by now experienced Joshua Dirksen leading the team. Dirksen is a curious case, definitely underrated before last season as he was solid in F4 and never had a good car beyond that, but I'll still be the first to say I don't believe for a second that he was actually better than Taylor Barnard on merit last year, certainly not by the extent he showed. Thus, I do give a lot of credit to the speculation surrounding his rather quick-looking engine, so it might be difficult for him to find the same highs again. At the same time, he'll now go up against Cian Shields, so Dirksen has a chance to look good no matter what. Shields was in the conversation for worst F3 driver this year and should by no means be near an F2 car unless he becomes a mechanic or something. Trident is in an interesting position right between my tiers. With Semi Megatunev and Max Asterson behind the wheel, they won't actually have an obvious problem, but I think statistically one of them will turn into an obvious problem soon enough. Neither of them has been particularly impressive in F3 and lack experience to make up for that as well. On the flip side, both have shown good speed at times, and Megatunev in particular I actually rate quite a bit when it comes to raw skill. Unfortunately, he also happens to be an incredibly crashy individual. I'd predict Megatunev to take that particular duel, but I think both drivers might struggle a fair bit compared to the other, more prepared rookies. This brings us to the midfield teams. So in reality, the teams that do not have any obvious weakness, but either a lack of experience across the board or an experienced team with no proper championship contender. Prema fits the first category all too well, and it almost pains me to put them this low down the order. Bringing in Sebastian Montoya to fill the second seat alongside F3 ace Gabriele Mini does show that Prema is back to their old, less ambitious way of crafting driver lineups, let's say. Montoya has finally had a decent season in F3 this time around, and to be honest, might even be a decent fit for the midfield car Prema brought last year anyway. For a potential title attack that is still rather underwhelming though. Gabriele Mini is a pretty known quantity. We know he'll be up to speed pretty much immediately, but he is not one to produce the magic flawless season needed to really put him in the title fight, I don't think. He is the first dark horse on our list though, in my opinion, and should have no problems dealing with his teammate. Roden fields the exciting all-rookie lineup of fan favourites Christian Mansell and Alex Dunn. One of them more famous for his social media shenanigans than for his driving, which is an absolute shame considering Mansell is actually a strong driver in his own right. In many ways, much more impressive than Dunn last year. The Irish rising star has shown pace throughout his maiden F3 campaign, no surprise given his history at all, but has really failed to translate it to the big results needed on that level. This is a pretty tricky one to predict, and I can definitely see this going either way, but to make a prediction anyway, I'll say Christian Mansell's extra experience, both from already racing the car and competing at a higher level for longer, will give him enough of an edge. Dams employed the opposite recruitment philosophy by taking experienced duo of Chris Maney and Jack Crawford, both entering their third year in the category. Both come in on pretty different trajectories. Crawford got to turn his career around by wiping the floor with Correa last year, while Maney got comprehensively beaten by eventual rookie champion Bortoleto. It is honestly almost surprising to see him return at all. I think Crawford should be able to handle him pretty comfortably, but at the same time, I don't see the upside for him either really. At best he can replicate what he already did to Correa last season. For this to go anywhere for Crawford, I think he needs to actually find himself in the title fight, something I'm not sure he or his team are fully going to be up to. MP Motorsports marks the transitional team in this tier, as they do actually have a driver that could be considered a title favourite. Richard Verschoor, coming back for the 5th season, reunited with the Dutch team and surely only a single goal in mind as the by far most experienced man on the grid. Whether he'll be able to actually fight for the title might be more in MP's hands than in his own, and of course a 5th-year title probably wouldn't get him anywhere anyway, but it would still be such a cool story. On the other side of the garage, young Olli Goethe is a bit of a curious case. He never quite struck me as good enough to actually be associated with a junior program on merit, but nevertheless is a quick and reasonably consistent driver. He shouldn't be able to challenge Verschoor on paper, and I doubt he stands a chance over the full season, but I think he'll have a couple of breakout drives for us next year. Next up we have the tier I called What If, mainly for the second team in here, and you'll understand why in a minute. But it is also quite fitting for Invicta, mainly because Leonardo Fornaroli is a huge X factor in my opinion. Yes, I have called him the most underwhelming F3 champion to date, but equally I was not super convinced of Bortoleto last year before he began shitting on people in F2. Thus, it would feel unfair to count out a surprisingly huge season for Fornaroli, especially given how good the team looked too. He's going to go up against surprise returnee Roman Stanek, now in his 3rd season as well, after a bit of a disaster last year with Trident. Stanek is by no means a bad driver, but I think even his peak form won't take him to the title fight. My brain still wants to predict Stanek over Fornaroli as far as the intra-team battle is concerned, but I am ready to be wrong yet again when it comes to judging F3 champions. ART is really the team I named the tier after. Between Victor Martin and Rita Mumiata, they have a lineup of highly experienced drivers, both really only here to be in the title hunt, I think. While Toyota's long-term plans for Miata may be a bit more mysterious, for Martins this is really the make or break season, if it isn't too late already anyway. He should have been a title contender last year, and I don't think the team ever gave him a fair shot. Let's see if he can fulfill this prophecy this year. He is certainly high up on my list of favourites. If both of these drivers could live up to their potential, then this is probably the single strongest lineup on the grid. Last but not least, we do have our elite tier for those obvious banger lineups, one of which will statistically let me down in a really depressing way over the season. It feels weird to put Campos in this category despite Isaac Hodge's wicked title run last season. The main reason for this really is Arvid Lindblad. In terms of excitement for his step up, he is the closest thing to Antonelli on the grid this season. He may be super young, but he has an excellent track record of picking things up very quickly, as seen by his outstanding rookie season in F3 last year. I doubt he'll have the consistency to actually win the title, but he'll blow us away with his pace at times for sure. Pepe Marti is a more curious case. Always been good and started his F2 campaign really strong last year, only to fall off a cliff soon after. He finds himself in a rather tricky position. To keep his spot ahead of Lindblad in the RB hierarchy, he probably has to beat him really badly. If Lindblad is close, he'll inarguably look the more impressive driver. I could definitely see them be close over the full season, but I do think ultimately Lindblad will prove that he is a step above. Hitech, now partnered with Toyota, didn't just have the quickest car last year, but also brought the best pound-for-pound driver lineup, when ignoring the magnificent ART of course. Dino Beganovic and Luke Browning may be rookies, but have both already collected considerable experience in the cars last year, and for Beganovic in particular it has been a huge step from slightly underwhelming in F3 back to the magnificent Dino from years gone by. I honestly got serious title contender vibes from his cameo at the end of last season, especially when combined with the ultra-strong Hitech team. Luke Browning may have been the most solid F3 driver last year, but this year will be a bit of a make or break for him as well. He is definitely on the more experienced side as a driver and feels at a risk of being found out a little regarding his raw pace this year. Unlike Beganovic, his F2 stint at the end of last season was pretty forgettable, but I do think he has more to offer than that. I still think Beganovic will take that duel, and potentially easier than it looks on paper. So, who am I actually predicting for the championship? Last year looked so obvious on paper and turned out rather differently in practice, while this season to me looks wide open when just looking at the entry list. Both ART guys have the raw skill, but will either struggle with the car or might end up taking too many points off each other. Gabriel Mini is entirely at Prema's mercy, as is veteran Richard Verschoor at MPs. Arvid Lindblad would be a miracle story, but of course those happen a fair bit at this level too. And finally, the engine lottery will of course massively affect the outcome as well. Nevertheless, gun to my head, I will actually predict Dino Beganovic to take it, despite his disappointing F3 stint. His end of the year just looked so promising, and he wasn't even in the Hitech yet. But this is where I really want to know what you guys are thinking. Who do you think will take the title? Go and drop your predictions down in the comments, and feel free to roast mine as you see fit. We can all have a laugh about it after the season has played out anyway. And if this happened to be your first time on the channel, you might want to consider subscribing if you're into feeder series racing at all, as I run a weekly show reviewing all things single-seater racing from F1 all the way down to karting. Either way, I thank you all for watching, and I do hope to catch you in the next one.